Okay, so welcome to Vibe, everyone. We're here in Mui Wo, we're on Lantau Island, and we're in Hong Kong. And when I was first heard about Bob and Sally Bunker, it was probably about 10 years ago, and they were described to me as Mui Wo royalty, no less, which I'll never live that down probably. I think based on the length of time, really, that they've lived here on this island, amongst only a few Westerners that have lived here for that period of time. And so quite fitting that we're here today on Lantau to listen to Bob's presentation. Just a few things for information. We've got two cameras, one which is facing that way and one which is facing this way. So if I can ask you not to knock cameras or ideally move around while we do the presentation. It's going to take about an hour, and Bob's got a nice bunch of slides to go through. And so basically, if you can ask questions at the end, so that Bob can get through his track of thought on this, and then at the end, I'll come round, just put your hand in the air, and we can take questions. And so that should be it. All right, so Bob's been here for probably, in Hong Kong for around 46 years, I believe. Since the 80s, the mid-80s, and he moved to, Bob and Sally and family moved here in the 90s. And during that time, he was obviously taking 35mm pictures, which didn't always come out well. Not what that we're going to see bad ones today. But thankfully, he's recorded a lot of what we see today and the history of where we've come from. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce Bob Bunker, everyone.
Thank you very much. And you have to, the IT department, your capacity is IT department. Here we are. So Lantau, a bit of history, some old pictures and a few memories. The pictures we have, quite a few of them I took, but as Gary said, 35mm film. Now, if you remember those days, youngsters nowadays don't understand this. You just point and click. But you used to have to take 36 pictures and then send them off, wait for 3 weeks, and when they came back, you found you had your finger over the lens, etc. So they weren't very good. So some of these pictures are mine. Some I've borrowed from all over the place. I've got them off the internet and everything else. So if I'm breach of copyright at all, my apologies. I'm happy to give proper attribution to whoever it is. Now, a lot of people say, Lantau, what happens on Lantau? There's no history on Lantau. Well, the answer is there's a hell of a lot of history here that goes back a long time. The 3000 BC or so, the Neolithic settlement up the far end of Silvermine Bay. There's also rock carvings down the end of Shekpik, down below the dam. Nobody can quite understand what they say, but they're very similar to the ones at Big Wave Bay, so obviously some fisher folk carved them. Now, going back to the 1270s, the Chinese emperor was crowned in Mui Wo. Mui Wo was the capital of China. Now, how many people know that? They don't make much fuss about it because I think they're a little bit ashamed, because it was the southern Sung dynasty, and they were at the time fleeing from the Mongols. So they were living in tents, so there's no traces of where they were or anything, but the emperor was actually crowned here. In fact, one of my friends who was digging his garden in Wang Tong came across some shards of porcelain, firmly convinced this was a historic 1270s piece of antiquity. He took them to a ceramics expert who said, well, I'm very sorry, they're not Sung dynasty 1270, they're Wing-on dynasty 1970. So that was all slightly disappointing for him. But then leading on from there, around about 1570s, Pak Nan Hung was founded. Pak Nan Hung white silver, that's where the silver mine was. There was a little bit of silver found there, never really commercial to any extent. 1660, there was a thing called the Great Clearance. Now, one of the problems China's always had in coastal regions has been piracy. And the only way they felt they could stamp out piracy was to drive everybody 25 kilometres inland, which of course decimated Lantau. So everybody was pushed out of Lantau. They only started trickling back in about 1669, 1670. Shui Hau, we've managed to find evidence that Shui Hau had been founded in the 1650s. There was very little here actually in the way of industries. It was farming, fishing, smuggling was a big time, and of course, as we know, a lot of that still goes on. There were lime kilns here. You probably know we have coral reefs off Chimawan and everything. All that was burnt down for lime. Salt pans at Tai-O, that was quite a big industry. There was a little bit of silver mining, but as I said, it was never really commercial. 1898, as we know, Treaty of Nanking. Britain took over the new territories, which included Lantau. 1941 to 45 was World War II. There was a garrison here in Mui Wo. There was a terrible massacre on the beach. About a dozen villagers were massacred. Interestingly, after Japan had surrendered, and actually several people were hanged for war crimes after. The Shakepik Reservoir was built in about 1960s. The South Lantau Road was built just before that, and that started to open up South Lantau a bit. Since then, of course, 1998, as we know, we had the airport, the bridge, the new Tung Road, etc., and all that changed. Anyway, our involvement in Lantau. Now, we arrived here in 79. We were still stuck in a hotel waiting for our company accommodation to fall vacant, and the kids were being a nuisance, so we didn't know what to do. So we thought we'd get on a ferry and go somewhere. So we went to the ferry pier. Now, I don't know if you remember this, the ferries used to be down near Shun Tak, and there was a restaurant there. You actually had to go up through the restaurant and trample through the diners to get onto the first class. The first class on those old triple deckers was actually quite something. In fact, later when I commuted, I found total luxury on the upper deck of those triple deckers. You could get breakfast served. It wasn't exactly haute cuisine, but it was breakfast, and it was very, very much appreciated. Anyway, we took the ferry over to Ping Chau. Ping Chau, we walked around a bit, and we got the little Kaido to the Trappist monastery. Discovery Bay was only just starting to be built in those days. And up at the Trappist monastery, there were the cows. And you'll notice these are quite different from the cows. That's actually a bull, by the way, if you look closely. But the principle is the same. They're quite different from the cows that we see walking around. So there's no history of them being the same cows. These were a dairy herd. The cows we see walking around were actually draft animals used for ploughing paddy fields. Anyway, from the Trappist monastery, we walked up over the hill and were confronted with, wait for it, Silvermine Bay in 1979. Now you can see what's there and what's not there. There's very little development along the bay. There was a place called Ned Kelly's Last Stand, which was down here somewhere. The lagoon had not been dug out and they hadn't canalised the river. Still got the fish ponds at the back. There's Luk Te Tong over there. You can see the watchtower and everything. The reclamation here was done in about the 1950s, but there was nothing much in the way built on it. Those places are still there. There's still quite a lot that is still there, but anyway, it's all changed quite a lot. Unfortunately, not a very good photo. I took this actually one-handed whilst trying to stop son Edward falling down the hill in his stroller. So it's not a very good photo, I'm afraid. If I'd known we were going to be living here, I'd have taken lots more photos. Anyway, but then thereafter, I'm afraid to say, I term this the lost years, because we didn't come to Lantau at all much. 79 to 85, we used to either go out on the company junk at weekends or go to Macau or explore the new territories. Things changed in 1985. My company got a holiday home here in Changsha, and we came over here for a weekend, and we instantly, like most people, fell in love with Lantau, and we thought we wanted to spend more time here. But unfortunately, of course, we only got the company place once a year. So I was persuaded by my wife to actually buy a little place in Shui Hau. And this is the little place we bought. You'll notice the Union Jack on the roof, being very patriotic. We were still a colony in those days, pre-1997. You'll notice we had a car here. Now, cars, there were only a couple of dozen cars on the island. And the answer is, it was very difficult to get a car here. There was no bridge. There was a car ferry, but it's never had a car ferry service. That was only used once every couple of months to bring police vehicles to and fro. So if you wanted to get a car here, you had to go through a tremendous rigmarole. You had to cancel your Hong Kong license, or you had to apply for a Lantau permit, and the police would come around, check you actually lived there, check you had somewhere off road to park it. They don't do anything like that nowadays. Once you got your permit, you then had to surrender your Hong Kong side license and apply for a Lantau only license. And having done that, of course, you could not drive the car Hong Kong side. So you had to get a man with a tow truck to bring your car to Jordan Road, to put it on the ferry, to bring it over here. Even in those days, it cost $1,200 to put a car on. And you just had to wait until there was the next ferry going. So once you had a car here, it stayed here. So everybody drove a complete wreck. And this explains why there are flowers on it. The tradition of flowers on the bunker car dates from this period, because every time a rust spot came through, my artist wife would paint a flower over it, and that's the reason. But interestingly, we used to leave the car with Mr. Lee at the Caltex station, and it would turn up on a Friday night. And there was absolutely nothing here when you came here on a Friday. You'd realise how different Lantau was. The whole area where Welcome is, that whole block didn't exist. The only supermarket was Park and Shop, which was actually where Red Hall Antiques is now. A very tiny place that sold a bit of barbecue stuff, etc. There was a funny shop that sold offerings for everyone who wanted to go up to the monastery. And that was it. The place was absolutely dead. There were no cars around or anything. There were no street lights along the South Lantau Road. And you'd be driving along in the dark. And the other thing that happened along the South Lantau Road was helicopters, because the Royal Navy had an observation point at Tai O. And the helicopters used to use the South Lantau Road for navigation purposes and would fly at 0 feet along the South Lantau Road. So you'd be driving along in the dark, suddenly a helicopter would go roaring over your head. It was straight out of Apocalypse Now. The other thing was, of course, that life was pretty primitive over there. In fact, I was ridiculed by my colleagues for buying property on Lantau because, I mean, amongst other things, we'd only just got mains water put in. Prior to that, there used a big tank on the roof that filled up during the rainy season, then you hoped it lasted through the dry season. So we were getting mains water put in, and suddenly I got a call from the village head that the government wanted to build a pumping station right in the middle of the village, and they didn't want it, and I was a Guilo, so it was my duty to stop it. So this was my first manhood challenge. So my first bit of lobbying government, I managed to persuade the government to build the pumping station a little bit further up the road. And there it is, folks. It's not moving. It's died.
Here we go. Is that?
No.
Pumping station?
That's it. That's my pumping station. So when you drive up the road from Shui Hau to Shekpik, you can make a note. There should be a plaque saying this is Bob Bunker's pumping station. But anyway, that's it. That's my first ever effort. This is a picture of Shui Hau. We were very privileged. We had a friend with a helicopter who used to take us for occasional spins. So we have some aerial photos here. Shui Hau as it was in 1987-88. As you can see, uptown Shui Hau didn't exist. You can still see there's the old schoolhouse in here somewhere. There's the village green. A lot of the old traditional village houses are here. That was our place. This was an amazing place. Great big house, had no furniture in it at all. And the old guy who lived there hadn't even got a kitchen. He used to cook on a wok over an open fire under a lean-to at the side. But also the other thing that's never changed, of course, is the lapsup in front of the village office, which is still there to this day. Not much has changed here in the way of farming. This bridge here was built by the Gurkha engineers as a training exercise in 1958, leads up to Loke 1. And one thing you'll notice is underneath here there's a pen with red-coloured astroturf underneath it, which looks as though it was a dogfighting pen. Now, I was never aware of dogfighting going on, so whether anything had gone on like that, I don't know. But anyway, that was the Gurkha bridge. And one of the things we used to do, we used to practice abseiling when the scouts came over. There's Mrs. Bunker's bottom coming down at great speed. That was good fun. More pictures of Shui Hau from a helicopter. You can see, this is later on, this is about 1992-93. You can see more and more of the famous Spanish-style three-storey houses are appearing, knocking down the older places. The other thing we had at Shui Hau was, of course, the cows. We had at one stage 105 cows on the wetlands there. And as you can see, they're quite different from the dairy herd that they had. These cows were actually used for ploughing the paddy fields. Sally became the an authority on the cow. She started logging herd sizes and all this structure. And in fact, there was a TV documentary made about her and the cows. She was known as the Cow Lady of Lantau. So much so that well-known local cartoonist Gavin Coates actually produced this cartoon of her showing all the cows standing around having a wild party, smoking and drinking and having a wild time. Suddenly they'll shout out, "Look out, it's her again." Next thing they're all kneeling down, behaving themselves, saying, "Phew, that was close." Yes. So they all on the lookout for it. When we were at Shui Hau, indicative of how off the map it was in those days, we could actually get Macau TV more than we could get Hong Kong TV, believe it or not. And the nearest place to go shopping was actually Tai O. And Tai O was actually a pretty rich, had been a pretty rich place because of the salt pans, which are still there, disused. They used to let the seawater in at high tide, then dam it and let the water evaporate and harvest the salt. So it was a very wealthy place. There's the old police station there, now converted into the Heritage Hotel. There's, people say, well, why was this built way out of town, right round the other end? Well, of course, it was Marine Police in those days. Lantau was administered by Marine Police until the bridge was built, when the Land Police took over. And of course, their job was to look out for smugglers, so that's why it tended to be there. Legend has it that also there were so many nefarious things going on in Tai O itself that the villagers did not want the police to know about, so they preferred that the station should be built there. Some of you may remember this before the bridge was built over the Tai O Creek. Little old ladies used to pull the barge across on this rope. The deal was that whenever a fishing junk or anything wanted to go past, they would drop the rope to the bottom of the creek, and the guy would cut his engine and drift past. One guy forgot to cut his engine once, and the whole thing got twisted around his propeller. And these little old ladies were not amused. They suggested to him that he should go home and carry on committing incest, because they thought he was better at that than steering a boat. Over here, this is a restaurant nowadays, but it used to be a timber merchant. And I used to buy wood in there, but the guy used to terrify me because he had a table circular saw where the motor was so worn he could only start it by spinning the blade by hand, which terrified me. But I used to look at him every day, and he still had all his fingers, so obviously he was getting things right. If we move on further around, we'll have a look at Nong Ping now. Nong Ping, the Buddha, it's about 1984, this picture. The base for the Buddha was built. The Buddha was only basically built in about 1988, 1989. The buses, funny little buses we had in those days, I'll tell you more about buses later. They look as though they belonged to Welcome Supermarket. They changed the livery later. But they were funny little things that went round the wiggly roads. They used to go to Tai O and to Nong Ping and also to Chung, because of course in the old days the old Chung road actually used to go along the catchwater for a way. It was a very windy road, and those were the only things that could go up that road. So the actual Buddha itself was built. Hang on, it's not moving on.
A little bit of a delay, isn't there? That's the thing. Go backwards. That's it.
That's it, yeah. The Buddha was actually built a bit like the Statue of Liberty. There's a metal frame with bronze cladding over it. The actual head, the original intention was it was going to be lifted into place by an RAF Wessex, but they found the poor old Wessex couldn't lift it. So what they had to do was they had to close the South Lantau Road one night. There wasn't any traffic in those days anyway much, so it didn't really matter, and bring it all on a low loader. But it was quite a job to get it done. Moving on to Tong Phuc, another heli picture. This hasn't actually changed that much. You can see the gallery is still there. That was run by Dollar in those days. Not much change to this. A little bit of infilling. This is Chung Sha. Yeah, I'll tell you about Chung Sha. Chung Sha was where the Marine Police headquarters was, and round the back of the headquarters they had their officers' mess, and they decorated it with all kinds of marine bits and pieces. They got sort of ship's steering wheels and ship's lanterns and everything, and they turned it into an English pub, and they called it the Crow's Nest. They had an English pub sign outside which showed a police launch with twigs up the top of the mast and a drunken crow hanging off the side. And for $300 a year you could become an honorary civilian member of the mess, and they used to have great parties there every Saturday night, and it was a wonderful community thing to do. But unfortunately, when the land police took over, they found that it breached so many regulations and was in breach of licensing laws and goodness knows what. So unfortunately, it was no more. Moving on along the South Lantau Road, we come to Sansek One. This is actually lower Sansek One. Sansek One, everybody thinks of Sansek One now as being up above the road. It was originally down below the road. There was a tsunami in about 1905, which caused the villagers to basically abandon that and move it back to higher up the hill to where it was. There are still bits, you can still see bits of the old village houses around here. This place has been pulled down now and is being turned into a sort of luxury gentleman's club, as far as I can tell, by a wealthy gentleman from Hong Kong side. That is still existence. That's where Joy Otway lives. If we just make a detour now to Tung Chung and what's going on in Tung Chung. This is Tung Chung as it was in about, it's not moving. There we are. This is about 1951. The cannons and everything are still there, but you can see that the lowlands, wetlands, the sea, etc., came right up to here. The Yak Tung estate is now about there, believe it or not. And this is a picture I took in about 1980. They've cleaned the place up quite a lot by then. The cannons obviously are still there. You can actually see the cannons from the road, actually see them poking through the trees. But Yak Tung estate is right there now, all completely different. This was Tung Chung as it used to be. It was very much off the map. There were only about 3 or 4 buses a day and 1 or 2 ferries per day from Tung Chung. There was just nothing there at all. This is as they were starting to build the new town. See, they're clearing this here. That's Tung Chung village as was, clearing bits around here and everything, because here is, it's jumping. Yeah, sorry, I got it. This is basically Citygate, Tung Chung Crescent, etc., all being built. Another heli view we have here. More pictures. That's the what used to be left of Cheklapkok Island. I've got a picture of Cheklapkok back in about, that's taken in about the 1960s. We used to go out there sometimes on the junk before they started building the airport. There was nothing there, just a few houses, a few farms and pig farms and that. There was just nothing there at all. And all that lot was pushed over and is now the airport. Coming on to Mui Wo, basically a farming community. That's rice harvesting down on the wetlands behind where Treasure Island is now. That's taken about 1960. 1970s it became uneconomic to farm rice, and that's when they turned all the cows loose and the water buffalo. One of the things they did have, big industries in Lantau at the time, was actually holiday homes. People used to come over for weekends, and if you were over here at weekends, the place to go was Charlie's. Now you notice it's called the Tong Fook store. It happens to be in Mui Wo. Don't worry about it. No. It used to be in Tong Fook, but he moved it to Mui Wo probably in the mid-70s, I think. And it was a great little restaurant and general store, but the reason it was the place to go was on a Saturday night they would have a Filipino group there, and it was just amazing. They'd be raising the roof until about 2 o'clock in the morning, so that's where it all happened in Mui Wo. Now here's an interesting question for you. This is actually a present-day photograph. This is this end of Mui Wo, 2 areas, wire netting. They're using them to store the drainage things, etc. Does anybody know what was there?
Petrol stations.
Petrol stations, yes.
2.
Now, 2 petrol stations next door to each other. Now, you may wonder, there were only a couple of dozen cars on the whole island, why they would have 2 petrol stations next door to each other. I can't the only reason I can think of is that government regulations and licensing laws stated that if Esso had to have one, Shell had to have one next door or something like that. But obviously they couldn't make any money, these two, so the Shell station had what I think as a cost-saving measure, I think it was the ultimate safety hazard and fire hazard. They actually had a blind petrol pump attendant, and it was quite fascinating to watch him because he wouldn't let you help him. He'd fumble his way around the car to find where the fuel filler was, and then you called out the numbers as it wound round. Nobody ever swindled him as far as I know. But the Shell station was closed, I think, late 90s. The Esso station stayed open until 2006, 07, something of that order. But anyway, all closed now. Now we have lots of cars around. They've closed the petrol stations.
There were also petrol pumps on the other side of the road where the school is now. Do you remember that?
No.
I vaguely remember that, where the school is.
Yeah.
There was one petrol pump.
Can't remember that.
outside the shop.
There was a tyre depot was down there. I don't remember petrol pump. Interesting. Yes. Anyway,
No demand now.
precisely another victory for government planning. Coming on round to Ham Tin. If you stand on Ham Tin Beach and look out to sea, you see these two concrete blocks. I'd always wonder what that was. So low tide, I waded out there, and if you wade out there and climb up into the woods, you suddenly find, like something out of Harrison Ford, Raiders of the Lost Ark, you suddenly find this disused temple. And the reason that is disused, as far as I know, is that the only access or main access that was through that jetty, and that jetty pointed straight at Puyo, and I'm told that the Puyo villagers said it was affecting their feng shui, so they asked for it to be moved, and that's why the Ham Tin Temple is now down at the other end of the bay.
Is the jetty where the two concrete pillars were in the sea?
Sorry?
Was the jetty in that your
Yes.
first photo?
Yes, they point directly at Puyo village itself.
The mics won't pick this
Yeah.
up, by the way.
They've just asked for the jetty.
Sekwu Chao. Now this, as we all know, is the scene of the world's most expensive and most ridiculously sited incinerator, which is going to start operation shortly. But did you know there are Roman ruins on there? And you may well say, but hold on a minute, the Romans never got this far. Well, here you are. The story is, they're actually fake Roman ruins, by the way. I cheated. They're fake ones. A drug rehab centre called SADA is on Sekwu Chao and is still there. And they had a swimming pool built, and then the commandant of the camp realised that most of his inmates were construction people and civil engineers and such like. So he got them to build like a Roman temple all around his swimming pool with statues and everything, the whole works. And it's quite amazing, this place is still there. They used to have open days and you could go out there, you could take a ferry out there. They don't hold them now. They may do when the incinerator's finished, they may hold these open days because it's quite fascinating to go there. And in fact, here's a picture of three of Lantau's lovely ladies getting up close and personal with a Roman slave. That's Sally Bunker, Colleen Thane and Joy Otway. It's a few years ago. Anyway, now we come on to everybody's favourite, Mui Wo. Now, question, how many villages are there in Mui Wo?
Official, recognised, 7.
All right? In fact, there's about 30.
Yes, we include all this.
I realise this is debatable because one is a village, not a village. And where does Mui Wo start and where does Mui Wo stop? But those are all the names that I've managed to find. If there's any corrections to that, I'd be delighted to hear them. Any ideas? Anyway, let me know later. Here's an aerial photo of Mui Wo taken in, I think, about 1960 something. Again, you can see here's the lagoon. Everybody living on junks and sampans there. There's Rural Committee Road goes down there. That's the Feng Shui Woods. There's a watchtower up in the top, which is still there, although it's ruined. You'll notice everybody's living on junks, and of course, there's a lot of what I think the government these days would call nutrient-rich matter. We all know what that means. Appears to be going on down there. I'll come back to that later. but that's all being washed out to sea there. There's another view of the lagoon here. It doesn't move on. It locks.
There you go.
There we are. This is a view of, again, everybody living on sampans and yachts. There's Rural Committee Road goes down there. You can see the church is there. And there is Mui Wo's first high-rise, number 63 Rural Committee Road, which is still there, being built at the time. Slight detour. Discovery Bay, as it was before Discovery Bay was built. Do you know the history of Discovery Bay, by the way? It was going to be a resort, and it wasn't succeeding at all, and the company building it was going bust. And they had a huge mortgage to the Moscow Narodny Bank, Russian state-owned bank. Of course, this was right in the middle of the Cold War. So the Hong Kong government suddenly realised that if the company went bust, they'd have a Russian state-owned bank owning a huge chunk of Hong Kong property. So they panicked and they tore up all the planning restrictions and let DB turn it into a housing estate, which we have now. But that is the history of DB. Back in Mui Wo, this is the ferry pier as was. The ferries, this is where the food stalls are now. The ferries used to dock in here. I've got some more pictures of this here somewhere. Another picture of, this is again about 1960, aerial view of Mui Wo. You can see there's the police station up the top. Again, Marine Police, so that's why it's built on the top of the hill, so they could keep a lookout for smugglers, pirates and everybody else. It's quite different in the days when the Marine Police ran it. It was much more relaxed. Also, they used to have what they called VPPs, Village Protection Patrols, where policemen dressed in khaki uniforms would go in about twos and threes. They'd walk around in the hills to the little isolated settlements and little villages up in the hills and keep an eye on everything and chat to the old ladies and check everything was all right. But you can see some of these, there's bits of, well, Wang Tong is here. That's the lagoon. This is obviously low tide. It silts up at low tide. More pictures of the police station. It's quite interesting. This is actually, our house is somewhere there. Where these houses are now, I've tried to triangulate it. They're not the same place as the houses are now. It doesn't make sense. But anyway, that's a view of the hill as was in 1960. Another view of the hill. There's the bus station down here. That place is still there. You can hire trikes from there. This was the bus station. This was the original ferry pier along here before they built the new one. Those buildings are still standing. That's where the Chinese restaurants are. Aerial view of Luk Tai Tong. If anybody remembers Luk Tai Tong, it's expanded a bit since then. You can still see the watchtower there. There's the village hall and the temple, all still standing. Yun family compound and the watchtower there. Watchtower was probably built in about 1920. The Yun family were warlords in China, and during all the uprisings and upheavals in China, they moved down here in the 1910s, 1920s, and set up shop here. Another aerial view of Mui Wo. That's where Riverwalk is now. Government flats have been built at the back there, but the rest of it is still as is. Interesting picture of the beach. This is where Ned Kelly's last stand was. You can see the umbrellas of Ned Kelly's last stand. This concrete fence is still there. It's the fence of the Mui Wo Inn, where they've got all the Greek statues in the garden and everything. Not sure who the little girl is. The beach, interestingly, was closed in about late 1980s, I think. They tested the water and they found some enormous number of multiple of the official World Health Organization's safety limits for swimming. So, as I said, there plenty of nutrient-rich matter was flowing down, and they found a lot of it was due to pig farming. So they banned pig farming, compensated all the farmers. That's why you see so many derelict pigsties around up in the hills. But it still took about 10 years before they could reopen the beach, because Silvermine Bay being so long and thin, the tide didn't scour in enough to wash it away. So So it was about 10 years before the water was declared safe for swimming again. Coming back, if I may, to the buses, if you want to know why it's called the New Lantau Bus Company 1973 Limited, it went bust in 1972 because there was only really weekend traffic. There was not much here. There were just people that wanted to go up and see the monastery at weekends. So the bus company never made any money much and went bust, was reformatted in 1973. And unfortunately, the new bus company was marred by this terrible accident where one of them rolled off the road coming down from Nongping. In fact, you can still see if you drive up towards Nongping, just before you turn off to go up to the monastery, there's an obelisk there, a red obelisk with Chinese writing on it. That's a memorial to all, I think about a dozen people killed in that accident. That was marred the history of the bus company. Here is the bus, the little buses we used to have. As I said, the funny little bone-shaking, short wheelbase rattle traps, and also the double-deckers. We had little lady conductors on the buses. There was no automatic fare collection. A little lady conductor would fight her way through the crowds on the bus and sell you a ticket. And you look at that and you say, wait a minute, they had double-deckers way back then, but hold on, the bridge wasn't here, the car ferry wasn't big enough to get a double-decker over, so how did they get them over? And the answer is, if in doubt, call in the army. And there we are. They used to borrow a landing craft from HMS Tamar. They'd ship the bus over and they'd build a little ramp on the little bay next to Seacrest Terrace and they'd run the bus off there. Unfortunately, the military gave up their landing craft in about 1994, so that had to stop and we did away with double-deckers then, which of course then meant we only had single-deckers, not enough bus capacity to get people up and down to the monastery, etc. So what did they have to do? So a very neat deal, the New Lantau Bus Company went into a sort of arrangement with Chung Motors, who actually run all the shuttle buses and school buses and everything Hong Kong side, which of course are not used at weekends. So every Friday night they'd grab a car ferry and bring a whole load of single-deckers over, and they would become New Lantau Bus Company buses. They'd stick paper numbers on the front and off they'd go. Sunday night they'd get another ferry and take them all back and they'd become school buses again. And in fact, New Lantau Bus and Chung actually later merged and I think is now listed on the stock exchange. A few Lantau artifacts, bits of old history. As I said, it was mainly a farming community. That's a traditional wooden bucket. I found this one in bits in one of the old houses in Shui Hau and I managed to erudite it all together. Interesting, you can see it was obviously carried on a yoke. It's obviously a very old bucket. You can see how the rope was worn into that handle. Two buckets carried on a yoke over the top. Managed to stick that one together. Here's another artifact, a Lantau, try again, a Lantau bus stop. This is the original version. You may wonder how I managed to get it. Well, it broke off in my hand. In fact, you can see they had a design defect. They were made of cast iron, but this lip down the bottom, all the rainwater collected in there, rusted through the cast iron, and they fell off. That's why they changed the design of them. This is not a full-size one. This is a model of one that I've got at home. It's a rice winnowing machine. Pretty well every village had them. You'd see them. They weren't in use. They were kept in sheds and such like. They've subsequently all been acquired by either government officers or senior police officers. Bought them and took them back to UK with them, and they now have them decorating their homes in UK. But this is a rice winnowing machine. The rice was put in there, handle turned like mad, fan blew the lighter chaff out, and the rice came out of there. Rice millstone, again we got given this one, weighs a ton, by the way, if anybody wants to try and lift it. But they used to have them in pretty well every village. There are still a few of them around. Moving on now to a few maps. Lantau features on lots of early maps because of course everyone was interested in going up to Canton. And the first thing you bumped into if you weren't looking where you were going was actually Lantau. So it appears on lots of maps. This is one of the earliest ones I can find, which is 1735, and you can see it shows just the end of Lantau there. Marks all the islands and the various shoals, etc. The main channel of the Pearl River is forever silting up. It's quite shallow and it's quite treacherous. It's quite shallow, that's why they managed to build a bridge across it, because it's so shallow. So in fact, the Deepwater Channel actually went round the north of Lantau. This map I'm rather fond of. It's 1763, and you know the classic British view is there was nothing here before the British came, you know, which of course is colonial bullshit. There was a hell of a lot here. If you look at this, all these islands have been well surveyed. You know, Ragged Island, Nine Pins, Waglan Island, Potoi, Lama, Chung Chau hadn't silted up then, it was still 2 islands, by the way. Now the fascinating thing about this is Hong Kong was referred to as Fan Chin Chow. I've never seen that name mentioned anywhere other than on this map. And also they hadn't surveyed the harbour properly. They thought Hong Kong was an island. At least that's one theory. I'm a great believer in conspiracy theories. This chap Dalrymple, who produced this map, was actually the chief cartographer for the East India Company. And I think that the East India Company did not want people to know that there was a jolly nice harbour here in the middle of Hong Kong, so they kept quiet about it. But you can see they'd actually surveyed the Deepwater Channel, actually goes round that way, and that's why the fort was built at Tung, because that fort controls that Deepwater Channel. Here's a better zoom in of that map. What's interesting about this is if you look at some of these islands, Tai Pak Island is shown as over here, and Boto is shown over there. And this intrigues me because I've also got this old print which shows Lantau Peak. This is 1793, and it says here that the islands in the front are Tai Pak and Boto. Now, if you look at Dalrymple's map, Dalrymple reckoned they were opposite sides of Lantau, so either Dalrymple got it wrong or he got it wrong. So it's one of those mysteries we've never quite sorted out. This is another map that I'm rather fond of because it's actually quite funny. 1810. What's interesting about this is they've taken the English names and they've transliterated them back into Chinese characters, getting them all wrong. So they're all wrong. Everything, all the names are all wrong. The Chinese names are completely different from what the original Chinese names were. But interesting, they hadn't surveyed all around Mui Wo at all. They just said there's lots of rocks along here. There's also a sign saying keep away from here because there's pirates. But you notice Pui O is marked, Chung is marked, Tai O is marked, but no mention of Mui Wo. I can't find Mui Wo mentioned on any maps prior to about 1950, actually. It just wasn't on anybody's radar. Anyway, Lantau's had more changes, I reckon, in the last few years. You're sticking again. Here we are. In the last 40 years, it's probably had more changes than it had in the previous 400. What caused it to change? The airport and the North Lantau Expressway. The airport, when it was being built, unfortunately, a lot of British workers came to build the airport because, of course, in pre-1997, they could just walk straight in and get a job. They tended to take over a holiday home, and about a dozen of them would sleep in it in shifts, and they would be making a lot of money and getting very drunk, and that did cause quite a little bit of, shall we say, ethnic tension that didn't do the Guaylo community very much good. But anyway, that's all over and done with, now part of history. Government came out with a wonderful idea. We're going to develop the north and preserve the south. That was more the deal. They were going to build the airport, build Tung Chung, this, that and the other, but preserve the south. Well, we know what that means, don't we? We've also had better and faster ferries. That's caused much more people to live here, much more demand for housing. The government-led improvements, I say improvements, well, they're talking about ecotourism and everything. We know what's coming next. But there has been greater interest in hiking and camping and tourism amongst the local population, also amongst mainlanders all over Mui Wo Beach. And as for what happens next, well, the East Lantau metropolis, if you'll excuse a bad pun, seems to be dead in the water for the time being because the government hasn't got any money. Ecotourism hub, well, we've been promised that. There's bound to be more development and infilling. And as we all know, we're going to glitzy new Mui Wo. Anyway, so that's basically about it. So any questions, anybody? Tell me any bits that I've missed out. As I said, I'm not a historian, so if I've got any dates wrong or facts wrong, please correct me.
Okay, thank you very much, Bob. That was excellent and very interesting for all of us Lantauers in this room, I believe. So, any questions, just put your hand up and I'll come along with the mic and I'll wave it in front of your face.
The cattle you showed have pointed, almost like unicorn horns. Not that I've seen many unicorns, but they're different to the cattle we see now with the curved horns. Was that a deliberate change in the cattle, do you know?
No, I don't think so. I think they were different species, weren't they? One of them, the small Asian brown. Sorry? Yes, they were the Asian brown cow. I don't think there was any particular significance in that. They were just different breeds. That's all. Yeah.
And when did the water buffalo show up? That was for
well, interestingly,
rice
the
farming,
buffalo.
wasn't it?
Yeah, the buffalo were mainly used for the bigger paddy fields and lowland
Yeah.
paddy fields, and the cows, much more dainty, were used for ploughing in the small upland
Yeah.
paddies. Interesting, as you walk up over to Chung, up the old Olympic Trail, you can still see some of these upland paddy fields. They're very, very
Yes.
small,
Yeah.
but they could be ploughed by one of the delicate little
ones, yeah.
Asian brown cows, as they were. The buffalo were mainly in Mui Wo. They, interestingly, only in about 1987, 88, there was a big storm, I remember, and lots of flooding. And they sort of moved out from there and started to move into Shui Hau, and they started to elbow the cows out. The cows then moved on down to Shek Pek mainly. And the buffalo also, because they've lost their habitat, seem to have migrated. They've become more upland buffalo, haven't they? You meet them when you're walking up in the hills, you suddenly meet a buffalo.
Yeah.
So they've basically morphed slightly away.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, any more questions from the room? Louise.
Your first, one of your first photos of Shui Hau showed that the wetlands were being cultivated still.
Oh, yeah.
When do you think the wetlands stopped being cultivated?
I think they were still cultivated for vegetable farming. Where are we? That's right. They were still cultivated for vegetable farming pretty late, and I think they still are, aren't they?
Some of them.
Yeah, a lot of them. Again, the same little old ladies. Those little old ladies look exactly the same as they did 30 years ago. Basically, they're all.
I think there was one that showed more rice. I think there was one that showed more rice being.
Not too close. That's all.
Don't think so. No, that's. It's mainly vegetable farming. Rice was never. I don't never remember rice being cultivated there.
Can I update
Yeah.
on that?
Yeah. What is the story? Yes. You're.
Yes. Basically, the government have started their revitalisation programme, and Shui Hau is the first village they've been using. And there are several projects now with the wetlands, and they're cultivating rice again. There are lots of rice paddies there, and I think it's Hong Kong U are responsible for the rice paddies, and it's Chinese U architectural department are up doing up the old village houses, and in inverted commas, they rebuilt one as a grain silo. There was never a grain silo in Shui Hau. There was an old village house where people stored grain. But anyway, at the end of the day, what they're doing is very interesting. And the artifacts that the villagers have now provided and putting into those houses, it's worth a visit out to Shui Hau. And as I say, the paddy fields now are actually starting to produce rice.
As
There's
they
a big
were.
programme
Oh, that's good.
around that. Thank you.
Well done, the universities.
Thank you.
Right.
Others?
Okay, any other questions in the room? All right, well, we'll wrap it up there. Just to say that I'm going to be interviewing Bob next week for my podcast, so we can find out a little bit more about the Bunker family and how they got here and what they've been up to and stuff. So that'll be out in a few weeks' time. and just to say a big thank you, Bob, for really, you know, coming up with all this is gold, really, for us that live here. So thank you very much. Thank you, Bob.
Thank you, Gary, for organising it all.